All right. America becomes a world power. We're getting into chapter 8 now. This is more of the historical part of our course. And we start with the concept of being a world power. What is it that constitutes a country becoming a world power? The main thing that really shows that you're a world power is that you control much of the world. How do you control it? Do you have to conquer countries? No. Military bases are the key. If you have a military base in a region or in a country, you have greater control than if you're not there, because you can send military assets, a ship, a navy, an air force, armies, whatever, and sustain them there. Then people will take you more seriously. If there was a naval base here that was French, then we'd pay more attention to what the French are doing because they have military assets on our soil. Um, this would only happen if we needed their help for some reason, or if they convinced us that they needed to be here for another reason that is for our benefit. And as you can see, America right now has military bases all over the world: Air Force bases, Army bases, naval bases, and we control, you could see our influence is strongest where these bases are. Well, the time period that we're talking about, 1898, we really don't have any naval bases, no military bases anywhere around the world except for our own territory. And so the concept of having these military bases, you have to have control, you have to have a strong alliance, you just conquer that country. And the Spanish-American War is the beginning of this happening. Well, how does it all get started? Ambition. Businesses are interested in resources from other countries. The country we're going to be focused on is Cuba. Cuba has sugar plantations, and we are interested in those sugar plantations for our business ventures so we can make money, increase trade. But Spain controls Cuba at this moment. If you remember, in US 1, Spain colonized much of the New World and other parts of the Pacific. But Cuba is right here, very close to Florida. Remember, Florida used to be Spanish territory until we took it over, I believe in 1810, if memory serves, somewhere around there. And now, almost a century later, the Cubans want to be independent. Remember the Monroe Doctrine, where we said that if anybody declares their independence, Europe can't come back in and recolonize. And so all of these countries from Spain started declaring independence after we declared our independence, and we said, hey, we'll back your independence movement once you get to be independent. Well, the question is, do we back a country that wants to be independent before it is independent? Is that part of the Monroe Doctrine? People were wondering about that. When Cuba wants to be free from Spanish rule, do we step in and help them? Yes, we know that after they get their independence, we will come and help them. But what about before? Do we instigate an independence movement? Well, in order to make sure that we do not lose any business ventures or interests there, we send a battleship called the Maine down to Cuba to protect our interests. The Maine explodes. And America, of course, blames the Spanish. They don't like us being there. They don't like being pushed around. So, of course, they blew up our ship, right? Well, that's the pretext that we have to go to war with Spain. The great saying was, remember the Maine to, you know what, with Spain. Later on, we'll find out that the ship just self-exploded. There was a problem with it, and it was an accident, and it blew up by itself. And it wasn't really Spain, but at the time, people didn't know that. And so we go to war with Spain. We send troops to Cuba, which is led, one of the leaders is a future president called Teddy Roosevelt. We'll talk a lot about him later. And the Americans send a navy to the Philippines. See, we got Hawaii over here. This is the Pacific, the west coast of America. And we take over the Philippines in this war. The Cubans will get their independence because of this war, and we will get the Philippine Islands. We'll give them $20 million for it. We'll get the Philippines, Guam, and Puerto Rico as part of the peace deal. And this extends our reach all the way across the Pacific. See how important it is? We have a base here in Hawaii, which is very important being in central Pacific. We can go in any direction, but now we've got, of course, got the Eastern Pacific, Central Pacific, and now with the Philippines, the Western Pacific. And so now we could reach China, Japan, all these islands down here through Australia. America is increasing its reach and getting more bases throughout the Pacific and in the Caribbean. It was not a very costly war to the Americans. In fact, they called it the Splendid Little War because it was relatively easy. We lost only 5,000 troops, and most of those were from illness. It wasn't even really from the fighting. And this was no small country. This was an imperial power, a global power, Spain in Europe. European countries had been colonizing all over the world and became very, very powerful. But if you remember the Spanish Armada in 1588, and Spain had been declining for a long, long time. And this really is the final straw that breaks the back of the Spanish Empire, and it never really will rise again to be a great power like it once was in the 1500s. America now takes its place as a world power by taking these possessions. And one last thing that I'd like to express is yellow journalism. We need to know this term. What is yellow journalism? Basically, it is journalists who push war in order to sell more newspapers. This is a very easy concept to understand if you think about how many times you watch the Weather Channel. Do you watch it every day? Do you come home and immediately turn on the Weather Channel? Most people do not. But they will turn on the Weather Channel when there's a hurricane heading or a big snowstorm might hit our area, big cold snap, some sort of major event is happening. Then people will tune into the Weather Channel. They'll start looking up the weather, trying to figure out what's going on. And these journalists figured this out a long time ago, that when there's a war, when there's a major event, people will buy more newspapers. They will tune in to the news channels more. And so they like the idea of having a war because it's something to talk about and people will pay attention to them a lot more. And so this became known as yellow journalism, where people, in order to increase their sales, would stir up war. They would say things like, hey, to heck with Spain, remember the Maine, this is obviously something that we need to fight over and they can't push us around, blah, blah, blah. And so they would show scary headlines and graphic photos to increase readership. And of course, this stirred up a lot of public opinion to go to war. And so we call this yellow journalism.